January 25th, 1947. Palm Island, Florida. 93 Palm Avenue. The man in the bed was 48 years old and weighed 160 pounds of sagging, ruined flesh. His mind was gone. Syphilis had eaten holes through his brain the way termites eat through a house frame. He couldn't remember his brother's name. He couldn't finish a sentence. 4 days earlier, he'd suffered a stroke, then pneumonia, then heart failure. And just after 7:25 p.m., with his wife May holding one hand and a rosary in the other, Alphonse Gabriel Capone stopped breathing. The most feared gangster in American history died in silk pajamas, in a bed, in a house with a swimming pool. No bullet, no ambush, no federal noose. Just a body that finally quit on a brain that had quit years earlier. You have to understand what that meant, because the Al Capone who died that night wasn't the Al Capone the world remembered, and the Al Capone the world remembered wasn't the one the movies gave you either. The Untouchables gave you a screaming, opera-loving lunatic swinging a baseball bat at a banquet table. That's Hollywood. That's Robert De Niro. That's Brian De Palma. The real Capone was something else entirely. He was a businessman, a tactician, a politician in a $500 suit who understood something no gangster before him had ever quite grasped. That in America, in the 1920s, in a city like Chicago, the difference between a criminal and a king was not violence. Violence was cheap. The difference was infrastructure. This is the true story of Al Scarface Capone, the Brooklyn street kid who moved to Chicago at around 20 years old, learned the business under Johnny Torrio, and turned the greatest legal mistake in American history into the most profitable criminal enterprise the country had ever seen. Booze, brothels, gambling halls, judges on payroll, cops on payroll, aldermen, mayors, newspaper editors. By 1929, Capone wasn't running a gang. He was running a parallel government inside the city of Chicago. But here's what the Untouchables didn't show you. Elliot Ness didn't take down Al Capone. Not really. The bullets, the raids, the axes through brewery doors, that was theater. The man who actually finished Capone wore a suit, carried a briefcase, and worked for the Treasury Department. His weapon wasn't a Thompson submachine gun. It was a ledger. This is how it really happened. He was born January 17th, 1899, in a walk-up apartment at 95 Navy Street, Brooklyn. Not Italy, Brooklyn. That matters. Because the myth wants you to imagine some old-world Sicilian bandit stepping off a boat with a stiletto in his boot. The truth is, Al Capone was as American as apple pie and appendicitis. His father, Gabriele, was a barber from near Naples. His mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. There were 9 kids in that family. Al was the 4th. He was a smart kid. Teachers said so. But he was also proud, and he had a temper. And when a teacher struck him at 14 years old, Al struck her back and got expelled. That was the end of his formal education. 6th grade. From that day forward, the streets of Brooklyn were his classroom. And in 1913 Brooklyn, the streets had teachers, real ones. Johnny Torrio had come up through Manhattan's 5 Points gang and had operations in Brooklyn. Frankie Yale ran the Harvard Inn on Coney Island. And a young, ambitious hood named Lucky Luciano was moving up the same ladder. Capone worked errands. He ran messages. He watched. At around 1917, working as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a small-time hoodlum named Frank Galluccio took offense at something Al said to his sister. Galluccio pulled a knife and cut Capone 3 times across the left side of his face. 3 scars. That's where Scarface came from. Capone hated the nickname his entire life. He told reporters the wounds came from shrapnel in the war. He never served a day in any war, but the story sounded better than the truth. The truth was that a teenage bouncer got sliced up for insulting a girl in a dance hall. He married May Coughlin in December of 1918. She was Irish Catholic, blonde, patient, and she would stay married to him until the day he died. Their only son, Albert Francis, they called him Sonny, was born that same December, weeks before the wedding. Sonny suffered serious hearing loss as a boy, officially from a mastoid infection, though some historians suspect congenital syphilis played a part. Al Capone had contracted the disease as a young man working around the brothels, and he reportedly never got treated for it because he was afraid of needles. That single decision, that one act of cowardice at 20 years old, would eventually kill him, but that took time. Around 1920, Johnny Torrio, who had moved to Chicago to help his relative Big Jim Colosimo run the city's vice trade, sent for young Al. Big Jim was making a fortune off brothels and gambling, but he refused to get into the new booze racket that Prohibition had just handed the underworld on a silver platter. Torrio saw the future. Big Jim was blocking it. On May 11th, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in the vestibule of his own restaurant on South Wabash. The gunman was almost certainly Frankie Yale, brought in from New York. The man who arranged it was Johnny Torrio, and the young Brooklyn kid Torrio had just imported to be his right hand. That was Al Capone. 21 years old, standing in Chicago, watching an entire city rearrange itself around a single business opportunity. Prohibition had gone into effect on January 17th of that year, Capone's 21st birthday. He took it as a sign. Here is how the operation worked, because most people have no idea. Prohibition didn't ban drinking. It banned the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol. The demand didn't go anywhere. Tens of millions of Americans still wanted a drink. What Prohibition did was hand a colossal illegal industry over to whoever was willing to break the law to supply it. Torrio and Capone built a machine to do exactly that. Step 1, the source. They bought industrial alcohol through front companies, redistilled the poison out, and cut it with water and flavoring. They also imported real Canadian whiskey down through Detroit and up from the Gulf through Florida. Step 2, the manufacturing. They ran breweries in and around Chicago in plain sight, paying off local police at hundreds of dollars a month per precinct. Step 3, distribution. Trucks moved the product from the breweries to distribution warehouses, then out to an estimated 10,000 speakeasies across Cook County. Step 4, protection. Every single link in that chain, cops, judges, aldermen, sheriffs, prosecutors, got a piece. The town of Cicero, just west of Chicago, was essentially annexed by the organization in 1924, when Capone's gunmen strong-armed the election for a puppet mayor. By the late 1920s, the gross revenue of the Capone operation was estimated by federal investigators at over $100 million a year. That's over $1.5 billion in today's money. From beer and whiskey alone. Add the brothels, millions more. The gambling parlors, tens of millions more. Racetrack skimming, labor racketeering, extortion of legitimate businesses. The empire was staggering. But every dollar came with a body attached to it. And Chicago in the 1920s was about to become the bloodiest city in America. Johnny Torrio was shrewd, but he was also cautious. He preferred deals to shootouts. He tried to divide Chicago among the major gangs, giving the north side to Dean O'Banion, the near west side to the Genna brothers, the south side to himself and Capone. It held for a while. Then O'Banion tricked Torrio into a bad brewery deal, cost him a fortune and an arrest, and taunted him publicly. On November 10th, 1924, Dean O'Banion was shot dead in his own flower shop at 738 North State Street. 3 men walked in, one shook his hand, and they pumped bullets into him while the water in the flower buckets rippled from the gunfire. That started the beer wars. O'Banion's crew, now led by Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, wanted revenge. On January 24th, 1925, they caught Johnny Torrio outside his apartment on South Clyde Avenue and shot him repeatedly, including in the jaw and the abdomen. Torrio should have died. He didn't. He spent weeks recovering under armed guard, then served a 9-month sentence from that brewery raid, and when he got out, he did something no one expected. He handed the entire operation to Al Capone and eventually sailed for Italy. 26 years old, Al Capone was now the boss of Chicago. And this is where the myth and the man start to diverge in interesting ways, because Capone understood something Torrio hadn't fully grasped. Fear alone doesn't sustain an empire. Fear is a maintenance tool. What sustains an empire is legitimacy. And so, from 1925 onward, Capone did something no gangster in American history had ever done at his scale. He courted the press. He gave interviews. He posed for photographs. He handed out turkeys to poor families at Thanksgiving. He opened a soup kitchen during the Great Depression that fed thousands of unemployed men a day. He sat in a box seat at Wrigley Field. He tipped waiters $50 in an era when that was a month's rent. The public loved him. Editorials in Chicago newspapers debated whether he was a criminal or a folk hero. The mayor of Chicago, William Big Bill Thompson, took mob money and gave the outfit the run of the city. When asked about his business, Capone famously said, quote, "I make my money by supplying a public demand. If I break the law, my customers are as guilty as I am." End quote. That line landed. It landed hard, because a lot of Americans agreed with him. But underneath the smile and the cigar and the diamond stick pin, Al Capone was a killer, and he was surrounded by killers. Frank Nitti, his enforcer, a small, quiet man who later handled labor racketeering. Jack Machine Gun McGurn, born Vincenzo Gabaldi in his mid-20s, former boxer, ice water in his veins. Frank Rio, his personal bodyguard. Tony Accardo, just a teenager then, who would help run the outfit for decades to come. The war with the North Siders never really stopped. Jaime Weiss tried to kill Capone in September of 1926, sending a convoy of cars past the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero and firing roughly 1,000 rounds into the building where Capone was eating lunch. Capone survived. 3 weeks later, on October 11th, 1926, Jaime Weiss was shot dead on the sidewalk near Holy Name Cathedral. He was 28 years old. Bugs Moran took over the North Side crew. And then came the morning of February 14th, 1929, 2122 North Clark Street, the SMC Cartage Company garage. 7 men tied to the Moran crew were waiting, reportedly for a whiskey delivery that had been promised by a supposed hijacker. It was St. Valentine's Day, 10:30 in the morning, cold. Snow on the sidewalks. A Cadillac dressed up as a police car pulled up. 4 men got out. 2 wore Chicago police uniforms. 2 wore civilian overcoats. They walked into the garage. The 7 men inside assumed it was a raid. They lined up against the north wall of the garage, hands on the bricks. Then the men in overcoats pulled Thompson submachine guns from under their coats, backed by shotguns, and they opened fire. Roughly 70 rounds plus shotgun blasts. The 7 men against the wall were cut apart. One of them, Frank Gusenberg, was still alive when police arrived. He had 14 bullet wounds in him. A detective leaned down and asked him who shot him. Gusenberg, dying, said, quote, "No one shot me," end quote. He died 3 hours later in the hospital without giving up a name. Bugs Moran was supposed to be in that garage. He wasn't. He was late. He walked up toward the corner, saw the police car outside, and kept walking. He survived. When reporters asked him who did it, Moran said, quote, "Only Capone kills like that," end quote. Al Capone was in Miami. He had a perfect alibi. He'd been meeting with the Dade County solicitor at the very time of the murders. Machine Gun McGurn was almost certainly the architect. Fred Killer Burke was later tied to the murder weapons by ballistics evidence. To this day, no one has ever been convicted of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But something changed after that morning. The public that had loved Capone, the folk hero, suddenly saw him as something else. 7 men shot to pieces against a brick wall in broad daylight. It was too much. The newspapers turned. The politicians turned. Even President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated in March of 1929, was pressed about Capone within his first weeks in office. Hoover reportedly hounded his Treasury Secretary, quote, "Have you got this fellow Capone yet?" end quote. From that moment on, the full weight of the federal government was aimed at one man, And this is where the movie gets it almost entirely wrong. Elliot Ness was real. He was 26 years old in 1929, a Prohibition Bureau agent, ambitious, honest, and telegenic. He assembled a small team of incorruptible agents who became known as the Untouchables because they refused Capone's bribes. They raided breweries. They smashed stills with axes. They confiscated trucks. Between 1929 and 1931, the Untouchables cost the Capone organization an estimated $1 million in disrupted operations. But here's the thing. Capone was making as much as $100 million a year. Losing $1 million to Ness was a rounding error. It was a nuisance. It made great newspaper photos, and years later it made a great movie. But it didn't break Capone, not even close. The man who broke Capone was named Frank J. Wilson. He worked for the intelligence unit of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. He wore glasses, sat at a desk, and hated cigarette smoke. In 1927, the Supreme Court had ruled in United States v. Sullivan that income from illegal activity was still taxable. That single ruling handed federal prosecutors a weapon they had never had before. You didn't need to prove Capone bootlegged. You just needed to prove Capone had income and didn't pay taxes on it. Wilson dug for years. He and his team went through mountains of bank records, hotel receipts, telegrams, and canceled checks. He found a bookkeeper for the organization named Leslie Shumway, who had recorded the profits of a Cicero gambling operation in a ledger. Wilson found the ledger among old seized evidence, where it had been sitting since a 1926 raid. He tracked Shumway down in Miami and convinced him to testify. He found another witness, a former Capone cashier named Fred Reese, and hid him in South America until trial. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion. The trial began October 6, 1931, in the federal courthouse in Chicago. Capone's people had already tried to reach the jury pool. Judge James Wilkerson tipped off, swapped the entire jury with another courtroom's panel on the morning of the trial. Capone's lawyers were stunned. The trial lasted 11 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Capone had never filed a tax return in his life, and Wilson had documented over $1 million in income he could tie to Capone by name. On October 17, 1931, the jury found him guilty on 5 counts. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years, $50,000 in fines, about $7,700 in court costs, plus back taxes owed. It was the harshest tax evasion sentence in American history to that point. Capone was 32 years old. In 1932, appeals exhausted, he entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. But even in Atlanta, he had power. He bribed guards. He got special treatment. He ran business from his cell through visitors. So in August of 1934, the Bureau of Prisons transferred him to a brand new facility built specifically to hold men like him, Alcatraz. On the Rock, there was no bribery, no newspapers, no favors. He was inmate number 85. He worked in the laundry. And the syphilis he had contracted as a young man, and never properly treated, began its final march through his brain. By 1938, he was showing clear signs of dementia. He would sit on his bunk and mumble. He would forget where he was. He was diagnosed with neurosyphilis. In November of 1939, after 7.5 years, shortened by good behavior credits, he was released into hospital care because he was no longer a functioning man. He went home to Palm Island. May took care of him for 7 more years. He fished. He played cards with imaginary opponents. His doctor said his mental capacity in the final years was that of a 12-year-old child, the most feared man in America, reduced to a boy in silk pajamas. He died on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48. A stroke, then pneumonia, then cardiac arrest, then nothing. What happened after him is the part the Untouchables never gets around to telling you, because Capone's real legacy wasn't the violence, it was the structure he left behind. Frank Nitti took over as the front boss, but the real power passed to Paul Ricca and later to Tony Accardo, who remained a power in the outfit until his death in 1992. That's 6 decades of continuous operation, built on the foundation Al Capone laid before he turned 30. The outfit went national. It infiltrated Hollywood unions. It ran Las Vegas skim operations for decades. It reached cities across America. Elliot Ness left Chicago in the early 1930s and became public safety director of Cleveland in 1935. He struggled with alcohol. He ran for mayor and lost. He died in 1957 at 54 years old, broke, in a small town in Pennsylvania. He never saw the fame that would come to him later. The book, The Untouchables, came out months after his death. The television series arrived in 1959. The movie came out in 1987. All of it built on a career that some of his own contemporaries in law enforcement considered mostly showmanship. Frank Wilson, the accountant who actually put Capone away, went on to become chief of the United States Secret Service in 1936. He served until 1946. He got a small footnote in the history books. No movies, no television shows, just a man who followed a paper trail to its logical conclusion and changed American law enforcement forever. Every financial forensics case, every asset forfeiture, every federal prosecution of a mob boss for the last 90 years owes something to the strategy Frank Wilson pioneered against Al Capone. Here is what the real story teaches you. The Untouchables sold you the fantasy that America defeats its criminals with courage and gunfire. That the good cop with the fedora and the shotgun brings down the bad man with the cigar. That's not how it works. That's never how it worked. The real weapon against organized crime in America has always been the same weapon Capone couldn't defend against: the accountant, the auditor, the clerk with the ledger. Because a man like Capone can survive bullets. He can buy judges. He can silence witnesses. What he cannot do is unmake the paper trail behind $100 million a year in cash. Capone built a shadow government inside Chicago. He fed the poor. He kissed babies. He gave interviews. He made the American people love him, even while his men gunned other men down against brick walls. And in the end, a modestly paid federal employee sat in a cramped office and read receipts until he had enough to send the Emperor of Chicago to Alcatraz. That's the story the Untouchables couldn't tell you, because it isn't cinematic. It's just true. Al Capone made Chicago afraid to say his name, but the men who took him down never raised their voices. They just kept counting. And in America, in the end, the ledger always wins. If this story pulled you in, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Tell me in the comments, who was more dangerous? The Capone Hollywood gave you, or the one the accountants actually caught?